for January 15th, 2025, as is called to order. Trustee Cavness, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the consent agenda.
Roll call,
roll
please.
call. Thank you. I missed roll call. Judy?
Mr. Kelly?
Here.
Ms. Cavness? Here. Mr. Cromer?
Here.
Mr. Shoemaker?
Here.
Ms. Harris? Here. Mr. Swope is absent. Ms. Pierce is also absent today. Mr. Land?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, item number one, the consent agenda. All matters on the consent agenda are to be approved by one action without discussion unless a board member requests separate action on a specific item. Does any trustee wish to pull an item from consent for discussion? Seeing none, I would like to offer a comment on item F, the annual trustee training and education report. It has come to my attention that many of us here are not completely up to date. There are many opportunities to participate and take the education items, and I would encourage everybody to pay attention to the emails that Judy sends out. And if you don't get those emails regularly, there might be some ways to get those forwarded to your personal account. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but in any case, I do encourage everyone to pay attention to those. There are several items coming up soon, and I believe, Doris, you had a comment on that you wanted to make.
I just wanted to point out that the Calipers General Assembly coming up in March is actually close by, being held in Napa. It runs, they say the 2nd through the 5th, but the course sessions actually start Monday afternoon on the 3rd, so you wouldn't have to be gone more than maybe 2 nights if you wanted to attend all the entire conference. That's worth like 12 hours or so of educational credit over that basically 2 days. And it's a great opportunity to meet other trustees associated with 37 Act plans, and I would encourage you to take advantage of our industry trainings.
We also have printed agenda for that, if in case anybody wanted to look at that, just because their new agenda is very awkward in our view. You can't print it. It's not a PDF. It's kind of odd. Is it online? It is, but it's just really awkward, honestly. I think it's just easier to pass that down. But it's a great opportunity. Lots of interesting things. One of us, I think, is going to go. Maybe both of us.
At least one of us will go.
Yeah.
So maybe another of us.
Yeah.
I would be interested in attending a day, perhaps. I don't know if you have to pay the full admission cost, so maybe that wouldn't be worth it. I would have to commute.
Remember to use your mics too when you are speaking so that our visitors can hear you. That is included in one of the emails that I sent out recently for educational opportunities. And there are also a number of virtual offerings that we've sent lately.
Go ahead.
Okay.
To attend this virtually? No.
No.
Okay.
Are there any further comments on the consent agenda? Okay, the consent agenda is approved by unanimous consent. Item number 2, historical benefit project status report and project updates. Doris.
Thank you, Chair Land. The current month's report is in your packet. With the completion of the half dozen or so recalculations in January, there are roughly 50 still outstanding. The completion date of February 6th from the original compliance statement, we have requested an extension and are waiting to hear from the Internal Revenue Service on that. I do expect that they will grant the extension, which we asked them to go out to July. But we should be able to wrap that up within the July timeframe.
Do we have any board member discussion on this item? Is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay. We'll move on to item number 3, investment matters. And we'll take item number A first with John Pironi, Senior Vice President, Capital Market Expectations. Are they ready?
Hey everyone. Yeah, I think Claire and John aren't panelists. I don't
Okay.
know if that matters. Oh, looks like they were able to join.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for joining. I did think I sent you. If you've never get that panelist invitation in advance of the meeting, just let me know.
We got it. We are just having issues connecting through our conference room. So we're joining together on a laptop here. Apologies for the delay. Can everyone hear us okay?
Yeah, was Callan gonna run that presentation?
I can share it. If that's
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Right. There was, you'll hear from, mostly from John today, but on the line from Callan are myself, Hannah, and John Perone. You'll actually hear from us every month this quarter. So as you know, we'll be, of course, talking about performance in February, but also interviewing emerging markets managers and international small cap managers in the coming months. But today, our key topic of discussion is just to talk about Callan's 2025 capital market projections. So I'm joined by John Perone here. You all have heard from John in the past, most recently in regards to the international equity structure study that we went through last year with you all. So happy to have John back. John is a member of Callan's capital markets research team, and that team spends all of their time doing really important work that affects all of our clients. So they're the key investigators on asset liability studies, asset allocation studies, structure studies. And then another important thing that they do every year is to really put their heads together and come up with our 10-year market outlook for broad asset categories. So again, that's the key topic of discussion today. The purpose of this discussion is just to go through those updated numbers. So what's changed in the last year since we talked about capital market projections at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of 2024? So what changes have we seen in the market? Where do we see the economy now? And how does that pan out in our long-term projections? Now, this is not an action item for today. It is just informational. But you will see pretty quickly that both our equity and fixed income projections have come down marginally. And what that means for your portfolio is that the expected 10-year forecast
Stole my punchline.
Oh, return has come down marginally from last year, but it's really right in line with 2023. So John will go through that in more detail, but I'll turn it over to John without further ado.
Yeah, no, thanks, Claire. Appreciate it. I'm just gonna see this. Yeah, morning, everybody. Yeah, if you could just flick to that first slide, or go back one. Yeah, go to page 2. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So where we're gonna go. We want to talk a bit about current market conditions. That if I was to have like a 30,000 foot kind of one sentence elevator takeaway, that Callan views the U.S. economy is healthy, but then as we kind of transition from the economy into the actual performance of the capital markets over the next decade, that particularly U.S. given high valuations, that we've incrementally decreased our expected return assumptions for the going forward. That we just flick to page 5. And so what we see here, the contrast of, and I remember talking to y'all last year as well. You see a comparison between this year's assumptions and then last year's assumptions. And again, we're thinking about what these assumptions are. We're not saying what the capital markets are going to do over the next year. What we're doing is looking over strategic planning horizon here over a decade and look at what do we project the annualized return of each of these asset classes to be, again, over the next decade. And so what you can see here, as I mentioned, for equities, you can see an income, and we'll dig into each of these. What you see here is all the asset classes that are embedded in your asset allocation. Okay, we'll go through these one by one in detail in a minute, but just again, high level, you look at equities, again, an incremental decrease in our forecast, and you'll see kind of under the hood driven by valuations. That's why we're penalizing expected returns going forward. When you look at fixed income, at the end of the day, fixed income is primarily driven by the level of prevailing yields. That is, yields are obviously much, much higher than they were, 3 years ago, right? So fixed income, a far more attractive asset class for your portfolio. And you can see, given the movement in yields from when we did this projection last time, you can see an incremental decrease in the fixed income. As we move to the alternatives piece of your portfolio, just like I said, valuations are essentially a headwind, particularly for the U.S. equity market. When we transition to real estate, if you look at the performance of the past 2 years, it's been a really painful 2 years for the real estate market. So there we've actually incrementally increased our forecasts because, again, thinking about valuations actually look a little bit more positive for real estate. And then at the end of the day, right, that you're investing, right, and obviously inflation is top of mind, right, because at the end of the day, those pension dollars need to preserve their purchasing power. And if you look, our inflation forecast is actually unchanged vis-a-vis what we had last year, so 2.5%. And we'll dig into all these things in more detail. Just want to kind of give you a high-level thumbnail sketch. Okay. So let's we'll hit some of this other stuff in a second. So let's carry on. Just want to have some brief remarks about the economy if we transition to the next section. Next slide, yeah. And as we're sitting here last year, top of mind was recession, right? That obviously didn't transpire. That U.S. economy has been robust. We think it's going to stay robust going forward. That if you look at like GDP growth on an annualized basis, we're running about 3%, right? Really strong. And when you kind of look under the hood in terms of what GDP is, the key driver of GDP is consumption or consumer spending, right? And so if you look at, that kind of 3% GDP, that if you look over the last year, about 2.5 of that 3% has been driven by consumer spending. And kind of what's under the hood there, consumers seeing real wage growth. Actually, if you look at kind of real wage growth, the difference between wage growth, which has been on the order of 4% a year, and inflation, which obviously is moderated, that's been positive, right? So consumer's been strong and powering the economy going forward. Obviously, you think about inflation, right? The Fed obviously has its dual mandate. They're trying to kind of tap dance between, right, full employment and controlling inflation. And as you know, that the Fed reduced interest rates, again, kind of short end of the curve, the Fed funds rate in the latter half of the year, right? They've reduced rates about 1%. So kind of a little bit north of 5%, kind of that cash short end of the curve down to 4%. We'll talk about in a second what we think they're going to do going forward. But in our mind, kind of the combination of strong GDP growth, kind of robust labor market, we don't see a recession looming on the horizon. So like I said, in terms of the economy, we're pretty bullish. And then as we kind of transition into the asset classes, right, slightly less bullish, again, primarily driven by valuations. Okay. The next slide. Let's just talk briefly about what interest rates going forward. As I mentioned, like the Fed, you can see the current level of the short end of the curve in the dot plot here. So right now between kind of 4.25% and 4.5%. And what the dot plot is the Fed releases what their expectations are for the short end of the curve interest rates going forward. And what you can see is that the Fed is saying that the central expectation is that interest rates will go down by 0.5% this year, and then as you kind of go out over time, kind of gradually go down to kind of like a 3% rate on the short end of the curve, right? So if you kind of that, and if you and often there's times where the market disagrees with the Fed, right? But it turns out if you look at the current market expectations, they're actually tie out almost exactly with Fed expectations, because you can look, for example, at Fed's like market contracts, like the Fed's future contract, and back out what the market's expectation is for the short-term rate over the next year. And the market's also projecting about a 50 basis points decrease. I guess what I would say is when you see these dots, right, these dots represent the expectation of individual governors on the Fed. And I guess what I'd point out is look at the wide dispersion, right? That particularly if you look over the long term, like if I was going to show you this picture long term, last year, the dots all kind of congregated at about 3%, but you can see there's a wide dispersion of views in terms of interest rate policy going forward, right? So a lot of uncertainty, right? And we've seen that, right? I mean, I don't know if you all saw, like today, the inflation report came out this morning, kind of below expectations, and the yield curve plummeted instantaneously, like 10 basis points, like huge move, right? And then if you kind of roll the clock back to last Friday, right, we had kind of a blowout employment report, right? The December job numbers, I want to say, were like 257 million, right? And then the yield curve shot up, right? So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty around what the ultimate level, right? But I guess from a strategic allocation perspective, right, I've got bonds in my portfolio that we feel very confident that bonds will provide a significant kind of anchor to the portfolio, both in terms of return and recall that in terms of defense in your portfolio, it's that fixed income that's providing the defense, right? So you're getting both a decent expected return and defensive characteristics. Okay. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's right.
Why didn't that 475, why isn't that maybe 50 basis points lower?
Yeah, let's actually best answer to your question. Let's dig into one of the detailed slides. If you don't mind flicking it to page 16. Okay. And so what we're looking at here, and again, what we're forecasting is the Bloomberg aggregate, right? So it's basically all investment grade bonds. So those bonds are going to be a combination of bonds at the short end of the curve, at the medium end of the curve, at the long end of the curve. And so what you can see here is the historical yield of the aggregate over time, right? And so what you see here in the box, right? Notice that we've obviously moved from a very low interest rate environment in 2000, right, where the ags were turning less than 2%, to this environment where more recently we've been range bound, where it's kind of bounced around between 475, 5. You can see that variability there. And the reality is that like I just said, today, because of one data point, the yields went down 12 basis points, right? You know, so what we're trying to focus on here is what do we think a reasonable expectation is going forward, right? And you can see kind of that green line represents a 475. Now, inside baseball, when we actually did the forecast for 225, because I want to link it back to your comment about the 525, we were actually kind of, if you look at that right graph, we're kind of at the top of that mountain, if you will. You see that kind of second hump in the mountain. We're about 525 when we did the projection last year, you know, and going forward, we're trying to kind of smooth things out a bit, not to kind of get whipsawed so much. So that's kind of a long-winded response, but did that provide some additional color? Okay, very good, very good. Okay, so let's go back to page 9. And so let's just have just a kind of a quick reminder about what the markets did in 2024. Okay, and as we all know, obviously the S&P 500 crushed it, right? It's the second consecutive year of 20+ returns. Okay, if you look at the international markets, right, you look in that second section, we've got, you know, the US, World ex-US, that's developed markets outside the US, emerging markets. You know, if you look at that 1 year, those 1 year numbers, they don't look that robust vis-a-vis the US number, but kind of underneath the hood is like that the dollar strengthened so much in 2024 that those international returns actually went down 7% when you kind of move from a local perspective to a US perspective, right? And so if you look at where the US dollar, I mean, by any arguable measure, the US dollar is, I don't know if anybody's been on vacation outside the country, the US dollar is incredibly strong right now. So that's been a material headwind for international equity returns recently, right? And so going forward, we don't anticipate that to be the case. And again, what are we using the assumptions for at the end of the day, right? We're using to set your strategic asset allocation. And it's really hard to do, but I think it's useful to kind of migrate from looking at what happened last quarter, what happened last year, to look at what happened over a long horizon, right? Which is kind of consistent with the planning horizon, you know. And so if you look at the U.S. equity market, for example, yes, it's destroyed it over the past 5-10 years. I want to say over the past 15 years, this has been the strongest 15-year stretch for the U.S. equity returns in our lifetimes, at least back before 1970, if you will, right? But if you look at kind of a longer horizon, right, now you're seeing equity returns on the order of kind of 7.5%, which is kind of in line with what our projections are going forward. One other thing, we've talked about fixed income. You know, again, we think fixed income should return a little bit south of 5% going forward. You know, real estate, let's look at real estate, and probably the best proxy for what's in your all's portfolio. Let's focus on that first line under real estate. So the NC-CREF index, right? So private. And you can see if you look over the past 2 years, you know, the real estate's gone down, you know, at least for this kind of broad index, on the order of like almost 5% a year, right? So it's been a big hit, right? And so that's embedded in our assumptions going forward in terms of having a slightly more constructive view on real estate given the current level of valuations. Okay, so that's where things were. And then so now I want to kind of transition to a little bit more detail on each of those individual asset classes. Let me pause there for any questions though. Okay, let's carry on to page 12. Okay. And before I dig into the individual asset classes, I think it's good from kind of 30,000 feet.
John, we have a question.
Oh, sorry.
You define long-term horizon, and of course you compared or gave maybe a short-term 15 years. What would you consider a long-term horizon?
Yeah, that was a little that I would, well, if you're looking at historical data to inform your projections, and again, that's just one input that goes into things. You want to look over kind of as long a time period as possible, you know. But if we think about setting your asset allocation, thinking about planning, that we use a 10-year horizon to think about setting our projections. You know, so it's trying to find a sweet spot in between kind of too short to kind of get into tactical day-to-day things, but you know, to kind of have a long enough horizon to make sense for planning purposes. Yeah, we could kind of slice and dice the historical returns in a myriad of ways. I'm just trying to give a little bit of context, you know, trying to kind of pull people thinking about the short term.
So, you know, the actuaries, Trustee Swope, you know, they're looking at like 30 years. That's like their long term, 30 years. Sort of like John's mentioning, there's multiple different factors that go into these types of projections. 10 years can be long. You know, once you start looking at longer periods, the model for projecting becomes more complex because there are changing environments, right? And so it becomes more difficult. Callan usually is the 10-year guy. Actuaries are the 30-year guys. So anywhere between those, I think, depending on what type of asset class you're trying to review, that would be considered long-term.
So what we see here on slide 12, what we're thinking about is what is the extra premium we expect to get from investing in equities versus fixed income, you know, and that's kind of the key driver of investment decisions at the end of the day, right? And so if you look back, you know, 3-5 years, right, when we were in that zero interest rate policy, bonds were yielding less than 2%, right? There's a very large premium for equities, right? So kind of tilting your portfolio in equities, we expect to get a lot of additional return vis-a-vis fixed income. And we look at today, and this is consistent message with last year, now the bond yields have gone from kind of 2% up to kind of 5-ish%. Okay, so that additional premium you get for being in equities on a forward-looking basis, we think that's going to be less, right? So what does that mean potentially for asset allocation? And I recognize you've already gone through asset liability exercise, but kind of other things equal, it would cause your portfolio to incrementally tilt more into bonds, right? Because the opportunity cost of moving out of bonds is less than what it was. But again, and you'll see that we mentioned the actuarial return. My understanding is your actuarial return in terms of a bogey rate is 6.5%. And what you'll see in a little bit is that we project your expected return to be north of that, right? So your current allocation we expect will satisfy that actuarial target. Yeah. Okay. So that was kind of macro level in terms of stocks versus bonds. Let's dig into each of the individual asset classes. I'm just going to do one page on each, because just kind of give you a high level flavor, but please ask questions if you want additional color. So let's hit the big one, which is equities, which should be the next slide. Okay. And so what we do for equities is we have fundamental relationship in terms of equity pricing. And what we try to do is chop equity return into different building blocks that we can forecast make estimates for each of those subcomponents and essentially add it up. So if you think about equity return at the end of the day, it's going to be a combination of two things, right? It's going to be a combination of capital appreciation and what income you get from the stock. It's going to be a combination of those two things. And then notice I've got this third term out there, which is usually silent, which we call a valuation adjustment. And we'll go into a little more detail on that in a second. But when, in our view, valuations are either extremely high or extremely low relative to kind of long horizon expectations. We make an adjustment to our forecast, and you see we've done that for equities this year. Okay, and so the bottom part of the page, I've just kind of showed how this model works for, you know, the S&P 500, which again is kind of the workhorse of your equity portfolio, right? You got 37% of your asset allocation U.S. equity. The bulk of that U.S. equity is going to be in the S&P 500. And so we're forecasting, again, on an annualized basis over the next 10 years, 7.25% return for the S&P 500. And again, that's down 25 basis points from last year. And if you look at these underlying components, the only thing that we've changed in terms of the modeling is that valuation adjustment. That last year we viewed U.S. equity valuations is kind of reasonable within historical standards, and that's changed after, again, another 25% plus return year for the S&P 500. Okay, and so 7.25 is the nominal return. And again, at the end of the day, it's important to be thinking about what is my return after inflation, or the real return. So if we think about the real return for equities in the S&P 500, it'd be that 7.25, and we project inflation over the next 10 years at 2.5%. That's you know, we recognize that the Fed's target is 2%. But if we think that if anything, they're probably going to err a little bit north of that. You know, if it's when push comes to shove, right? If it's a choice of kind of choking off the economy, having extremely restrictive monetary policy versus kind of protecting the economy in terms of unemployment, we would say that where that kind of falls out is, hey, you know, if we have inflation 2.25, 2.5, that's fine if we're not killing the economy. Okay, and we always look at market expectations when we set these things as well. So, for example, the market has, which is called the TIPS break even. So it's the difference in the yield in a 10-year nominal treasury and a 10-year TIP, which is inflation protected. And if you look at that right now, just looked at it before the call, it's like 2.44%. You know, so the 2.5%. And I guess it's important to look at history too. If you look at the inflation over the past 25 years, since obviously been a wild ride with deflation, inflation, but it's been 2.6%. So again, inflation, we think 2.5% is a reasonable place to settle on. And so what that means is, on a real basis, you're getting a little bit. We expect you get a little bit less than 5% real on the equity piece of your portfolio. And again, that's slightly below kind of the long-term historical experience. That if you look at what is the return of the global equity markets on a real basis, if you go back over 125 years across 25 countries, it's been about 5%. So our projections are a little bit more bearish than kind of the long-term expectation. Okay. Any questions there? The next two slides are just valuations, so I'll hit them pretty quick. So U.S. equity market here, we're looking at the S&P 500. And what we're looking here is the kind of the highlight is that graph in the center of the page. We're looking at P ratios over time. And you can see right now, this is as the end of the year, that P's are elevated relative to historical extremes, right? You can see, you know, obviously the biggest kind of extreme in terms of valuation, you can see kind of rolling in kind of the late 90s, right, in terms of the tech bubble. But you can see kind of a host of metrics here that look overvalued, right, vis-a-vis historical metrics, if you will. So again, we've made a modest adjustment to our U.S. forecasts that we don't like to be tactical, but, you know, we're faced with data like this, we feel compelled to make some degree of adjustment to our equity forecast going forward. Okay. So U.S. valuations elevated. It's a different story when we look at international, which is the next slide. And we've decomposed international into two components. The top, you see the developed markets outside the U.S., and then you see the EM. And you can see there that valuations look much more in line with historical norms. You know, that I want to say that international valuations are on the order of like a third less than what the U.S. valuations are right now. So again, we just made that valuation adjustment for the U.S. equity market. Okay. I want to say the next slide is fixed income. Yes, we've already talked about this. So again, a little bit south of 5% expected return for the investment grade universe over the next 10 years. And then I think the next slide is the real estate piece. And remember, I mentioned at the start that we now are starting to view real estate, the kind of valuations, as a bit of a tailwind as opposed to a headwind. Okay, and you can see that if you look at the chart, cap rates. What cap rate is it's net operating income divided by the valuation of the property. Okay, so think of that as it's a valuation metric, just like the PE is, right? Same idea. And so when that cap rate goes up, that makes for more favorable valuations, right? And no surprise, right, as those property values have gone down over the past 2 years, that we see, particularly for office, right, that's that light blue, you can see those capitalization rates going up. And so the upshot of that is an incremental increase in our real estate projections from last year. Okay. And then I think the next piece is kind of the grand finale, if you will, like taking your asset allocation and rolling it up. And so what you can see here is that our projection of the next 10 years, based off the new capital market assumptions, slightly north of 7%, right? Still above that 6.5 bogey rate, So we're, as Claire mentioned, we're basically back where we were in 2023, That's so incremental decrease from last year. But, we kind of captured some of that gain, right, in terms of 25% equity, U.S. equity return, right? So it makes sense going forward that the numbers would be slightly less, but still favorable in the grand scheme of things. And I think the real kind of buoy, if you will, what's so much better about the capital markets now than 3 to 5 years ago is just you're getting so much more pop from the fixed income piece of the portfolio than you were previously, right? So that makes it much, if you're getting 5 from the fixed income piece, right, getting to 6.5 is a much more easy task. And moreover, you don't need to take as much risk to get there as you would, obviously, 3 to 5 years ago, where the only game in town, what fear of missing out, or, the only game in town was, being aggressive in terms of growth to try to capture those bogeys. Okay, so that's in a nutshell, our thinking, so I think good news, right? In aggregate, right? They're kind of steady as she goes, and we expect a decent year or a decent decade going forward.
Okay. Are there any questions this time?
I have another question on, I'm curious about slide 15. If you're looking at slide 15, there's a couple points on this where EM sort of diverges from the developed ex-US, 06 to 07. There's a little bit of a divergence in 16 to 18, and then the current time period where EM's, stretching, that valuation's stretching a little bit. I wondered if you could, maybe talk possibly about the recent period there. What's sort of contributing to that in your view?
Well, it's interesting because this data only goes through the end of September. That China has certainly been the laggard. So, but if you look over Q4, it popped like 30%. Right? So if we were to refresh this number, I would expect P to be more in the historical range. And again, I guess what I would say is we don't take making the valuation judgments lightly, So you can see, it's like one standard deviation above the history, but things really have to be tweaked for us to start adjusting the numbers. And again, when you look at that previous slide in terms of the U.S., if you look at a variety of metrics, maybe
Any further questions? Okay, I guess, thank you very much for your presentation. Public comment? Is there any public comment on this
There
item?
is no public comment.
So that would take us to item 3B, November 24 preliminary monthly investment performance report. Robert?
Trustees, you have the November report in front of you. You can see that we did a little bit of rebalancing, just because there was a lot of hype at that time, you know, in the S&P's obviously been doing a stellar job. And so we took that opportunity to rebalance a little bit, pull some money out there and put it into some of the markets that, you know, try to get our allocations closer to target. You'll notice in the following item in December, we didn't do that. We may kind of hold off on that a little bit as we make selections over the next month or two here on EM and international.
Are there any questions? Is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay, that closes item 3. Let's move on to item 4, quarterly board work update plan. Doris?
Thank you, Chair Land. The strategic plan update is in your board packets. It gives current status on several different action items relating to the strategic plan. A couple of dates have been revised. We're currently heavily engaged with our risk assessment consultant who is assisting us with development of the agreed upon procedures audit universe, and we will be issuing a RFP here shortly to have a firm in place by the end of the fiscal year to start those audits with the next fiscal year. The board calendar was also included for your reference. Not a lot of updates to that. I did add a list at the back of it that talked about our planned in-house educational sessions that will occur at board meetings, and then also provided a list of some of the upcoming conference and virtual events through our industry sponsors like Sackers and Calipers. One other item that was part of the consent agenda was the member engagement metrics. That has been expanded to include new Google Analytic data on the usage of Member Direct and even our county web pages, in addition to our customer service survey and things of that nature. I did want to point out that some of those metrics will eventually be incorporated into the work plan as far as items that we may bring forth as far as initiatives, depending on the results of those member engagement metrics. And I wanted to point out specifically that we had introduced that customer service survey, and there were a lot of very complimentary comments regarding staff interaction that I wanted to make sure the board was aware of. That concludes my comments on the board work plan, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Quincy?
More of a comment. I appreciate all the work that's been done on the separate account functionality and the bifurcation of benefits for DROs. And it was exciting for me to see a completed date on that report. And I know it also applies to your executive director report later on in the agenda, but I know it's appreciated by the members, and thank you for seeing it through to the finish line.
Further comments, questions? Is there any public comment?
There's no public comment.
All right, that moves us on to item number 5, the administrative report. Executive
Thank
Director.
you, Chair Land. Couple of board reminders. If you have not already paid your waiver of recourse premium, the $9 is due. Please provide that to Judy. The waiver of recourse premium covers your insurance premium to prevent our fiduciary insurer from coming back against you as an individual to try to recoup any losses that they paid. So, for $9, it provides you with a lot of, security, and I would recommend that you take advantage of that. We can only provide that if the individual trustee pays that premium. So, also, Form 700 for the Fair Political Practices Committee, which is your economic disclosure forms for 2024, are due by April 1st. So I know Judy also sent out information on that, but please be sure to complete your form and get that to Judy. I wanted to point out that MSARA is partnering with the county as far as their wellness trainings. Now their health and wellness training also includes health, wellness, and retirement trainings, and we're scheduled to present with them at 2 events during calendar year 2025. We have the spring pre-retirement seminar coming up. It is being offered only virtually this time. That's coming up in March. And the construction is essentially wrapped up. We're finishing up the very last of it, which was one of the change orders to include a service counter at one of the windows next door that was omitted from the original plans. That got installed yesterday. They should be wrapping that up as far as any final painting, and I believe that takes care of the rest of it. The rest of the landscaping will be done as by our landscaping firm. It's not part of the construction contract, so the construction is essentially done now. And so we're pleased to be through with that. And with the split accounts, yes, we have a customization in, but we are actually able to function and process split account draws. We have processed our first one, or in the process of splitting it, and we'll be sending out notice to the member and non-member former spouse shortly if that letter hasn't already gone out.
Outstanding. Are there any comments, questions at this time? Oh, we have item B. Okay, no, that was covered. I'm sorry. Are there any questions at this time? Nope. Public comment.
There is no public comment.
Okay, that brings us to item 6, general board discussion. Would anybody like to offer any discussion items? Any other discussion items? Okay, that will bring us to closed session. Item 7, the board will move to closed session for the following items. Conference with labor negotiator Doris Rentschler regarding negotiations with McSara staff in the confidential unit pursuant to Government Code Section 54957.6.
The board met in closed session on item 7 and gave direction to its labor negotiator.
Okay, that brings us to item 9, adjournment and notice of next Board of Retirement meeting. The next Board of Retirement meeting will be held in the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association Boardroom, 625B Kings Court in Ukiah, California, Wednesday, February 19th at 8:30 a.m. And the meeting is adjourned at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
And all I can say is